I've ever been this honest on a podcast. What I'll speak to is what I know. There was a softness, a very mystical softness that I was raised with. Both my parents were Muslim. My father, I often say, was my first spiritual teacher. There is a way to communicate with the other world. It's just a matter of learning the ways in which that can happen.
Hi, Dina.
Hi.
It's wonderful to have you on the first episode of States of Creation. Your practice is rooted in ancestry, in spirituality. But I would like to start this conversation before we dig into your practice. I want to start this conversation by understanding your spiritual background.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. This is such an honor to be on the first episode of this podcast. It's much needed. So my name is Dina Nur Satti. I'm originally from Sudan and Somalia. And then I was mostly raised between Paris, France, and Nairobi, Kenya. And so my spirituality was very interesting growing up, I think, because of all of these different influences. Both my parents were Muslim, but when you dig deeper into the history of that region, we were many things at many different times. And so on the Nubian side, we were Christian Nubians. So my father's family is from Dongola in north of Sudan, and that was one of the Nubian empires that was a Christian empire up until it was converted to Islam very slowly. And then on my mother's side, Somalia was Muslim a lot longer, or Islam came before it came into Sudan. So they've been Muslim for much longer. But we also had Jewish Yemenite Jews that came in as well. So there's also stories of my mother's lineage a very long time ago being Yemenite Jewish. And so there is this amalgamation of all these different influences. And then what we're going to be talking about today is the influence way before that people think stopped, but it never really did. We just kind of folded our animist indigenous beliefs. And this is why Islam looks so different from country to country. I'll meet people from West Africa, or my friends from the Levantine, or my friends who are, from Iran. And we just will look, and Islam is so different because it's really culturally different. And so the way that I grew up was very interesting because even within Sudan, Islam is practiced very differently from region as well as within families. So a lot of the time people will argue about what Islam is in Sudan or what religion is in Sudan because we all are bringing in our own personal narratives and our family narratives. So what I'll speak to is what I know, which is my family, which is very unique and different from most families.
Right.
So I would say that we practice Islam in a way that very much is rooted in our Nubian ancestry. And I think that's a varying degree for a lot of different Nubians, depending on how recently your family has moved from the ancestral lands. I would say then my grandmother on my father's side, she comes from what would be considered more of like a Sufi lineage. And so we had this interesting mix where I would say it was a very matriarchal family. I think she was the center of our family. And then I would say that the men also were raised to treat the women in a way that maybe is very different from the more patriarchal aspects of Sudanese culture. So the way that I experienced Islam was very gentle. I had parents growing up where my father, I often say, was my first spiritual teacher because I would stay with him, long nights and ask questions and tell him how I questioned the existence of God. And
that's amazing.
What was so beautiful is that he was like, your path as a Muslim is to find your path and to find yourself and also to find God in your own way. And I always thought that was so wise because if you go down a spiritual path, you will always find your way to God, your way to spirituality, even if it's different from what your parents have raised you with.
Right.
So I felt like for me growing up, it was much more about that discovery. And there was a softness, a very mystical softness that I was raised with that definitely is part of the way that my family practices. And I would say that they would be considered maybe a little bit more liberal, especially because, education was such an important thing in our family. My grandmother's family, there's a story that my great-grandfather, so my grandmother's father, really believed in women's education at a time where in their village, they didn't believe in it. And so he would take my grandmother and her sister on a horse every morning to school, and people would throw rocks at them because they didn't believe in women being educated in that way. So because we have that aspect in our family, I think we practice religion as well as the position of women in our family very differently from a lot of people. So I think that influences even the way that I see the world.
Right. And I think that what's so interesting, it seems that this way of thinking of spirituality and living it, it's very much anchored in your artistic practice, right? You often talk about working your art outside of the studio, or cleansing your body. What are like the rituals that you have kept maybe from your childhood, and what are the rituals that you are doing now that help you every day, but also that help you with your artistic practice?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we have in our culture is this awareness of space and body. So we're constantly in this state, and this is something that I was raised with, where you're in this place of purification, because we believe that by purifying your body as well as your space, you're protecting yourself. And so there's this whole system of protection that we have. And if we go into kind of like the cosmology of Islam, for instance, that very is aligned with the cosmology even of some animist cultures, is that they believe that you have the seen world and the unseen world. And so the same world that we have here, superimposed on top of it, is a world and a dimension that we don't see. And that there are spirits and beings. You know, people talk about, it's popular to talk about jinns, but what people don't understand is a jinn is anything that isn't human and that isn't an angel. So anything is a jinn. You know, a gnome is a jinn, a fairy is a jinn. You know, all of these things are all classifications of jinns. And so in that way of thinking, you can sometimes attribute things going wrong to maybe having an influence from something from the other world.
Right.
And so part of the daily practice is to always be in this place of adjusting your energetic resonance through the practice of usually plants and different allies. So we have a practice of like incense cleansing.
Right.
Most women in every house, you know, in Sudan and Somalia and many parts of the global south where there's incense practices, and I'm sure in some of the parts of the global north as well, you walk around every day and different incenses are used for different things. And then there's also that aspect of like cleansing your body. Ritual cleansing is very important. You know, cleanliness is next to godliness. Like we have that also in our culture. And so when I talk about it in terms of cleansing for my practice, is that I'm working to basically put myself into a state where I'm able to then have a very clear channel to create. And that's in the moment where I'm creating, but it's also in the day-to-day, because what I'm trying to do is to basically create a resonance in my life in which I'm continuously moving through through space in a way where I'm not kind of held down by things that might not serve me. So the way that I see it when it comes to working as an artist is that you have this channel and that you might have blocks around the channel. And so that block can be karmic. That block can also be something that you've been taught through conditioning. That could be the shame, the guilt, the patriarchy, the need for validation, ego, whatever it is. And part of the practice is to excavate all of those things and to see which things are almost like latched on to your energetic body and to try to cleanse them. You know, some people, it's popular to talk about shadow work. You know, you're going into your own being and seeing the things that are not yours, that have built your identity that you think is you, but isn't really you. Right. And so that's why for me, the practice of making art is actually a complete lifestyle, because it's not about the times where you're making art. The times where you're making art is just the accumulation of the work that you've done up until that point. Right. And so part of the work is to actually go within yourself. And that's the practice of self-awareness, you know, is how do you then increase your intuition, increase your sensitivity, which is what artists also have a superpower with, right? To then feel within your body what it is that is not yours, and then go through that practice of excavating it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because it seems to be very, very much linked to the material that you're using, because you're using clay.
Yeah.
There's this idea of excavating.
Yes.
There's this idea that like the clay carries all the lands.
Mhm.
It carries everything that has happened to the lands.
Yeah.
It also carries our ancestors in some ways, because
Yes.
often our ancestors have been putting into that
Yes.
land, right?
Yes.
So you talk specifically about clay as being a teacher and an initiator.
Mhm.
What does clay has taught you?
Yeah. I think that, in the practice of any mystical practice, anything can become a teacher because it's your psyche creating the space in which you have a container to learn. I think what's really special about clay, it is one of the oldest mediums in the world.
Right.
And it is something that has been used across different traditions. And it is something that's utilizing earth. And there's something in the alchemy of clay. There's a resonance because it carries the land and it carries history and it carries time. That for me, it feels like it almost has a mind of its own. I think with anybody who's worked with clay and tried to mold it, you want it to go a certain way, and any material really, and it doesn't go that way. So for me, I see that almost like it's a person, it's a being, and it wants to become something. And often when I work with clay, I don't sketch, I don't make a plan. My practice actually is to completely let go of the idea of what I want to make and to sit with the clay and then just allow it to tell me where it wants to go. And so that's how I discover my forms. And the reason why I say it's also an initiator is I've had times when I've stepped away from it and then I've come back to it and I've been technically even better. It's because it almost told me, like, take a moment. You need to work on yourself before you can come back to me. And so it has, to me, for me personally, it's a being that almost communicates to you and is teaching you along the way about yourself.
So do you feel that the actual clay and the act of working the clay is a way for you to communicate with your ancestors, or with it's like a portal?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the three things are happening. There's the material that is embodied, that becomes a physical thing, that is one actor. There's me as the vessel. And then there's these ancestors that are supporting that whole communication. And so I feel like it's a container through which I can experience my ancestral transmissions. And because of also the way that I use clay, I don't use a wheel. I use a coiling, which is a very old method of rolling coils and then adding to them. And you spin a small little hand wheel. And there's something about the circular motion when I'm working that brings you almost into this like rhythmic trance. Like I can hear the movements. There's this synesthesia that happens.
Yeah.
And then in that state, you can receive information of like where it wants to go, or you can like hear ideas that kind of just get dropped, get downloaded into your psyche. And then the other thing that I also receive is that I'll see flashes of where the piece wants to go. So I'll see a form and I'll be like, this is what I want to become. And in that moment, I do feel like the ancestral aspect comes out through that, but it also particularly comes out in the moments in between when I'm working. I think that, the idea of ancestors, I think, is so foreign when you've grown up in a Western framework. Luckily for me, growing up in the cultures that I grew up in, there was a lot more openness to it. But even then, I think Islam creates a container in which people are very afraid of those communications, because there's ways in which it's accepted for ancestors to communicate. So through dreams, is very accepted. I think a lot of cultures, people, and even in Islam, I think there's Ibn al-Arabi, which is one of the Islamic scholars, has a whole book that is about dreaming, and that the idea that you're actually in communication with the other world when you're dreaming.
Right.
But I think even within my family, there is this fear of actual ancestral communication in your awake state.
Right.
And I think a lot of people in the West also are afraid of it, because there is this fear of like, is my mental state okay? Am I having a schizophrenic break? Because we've been taught that we are only living in a material world and only things that we can observe are valid. But what I've noticed is that over time, if you become a little bit more aware with the support of your community and people that you trust, that there is a way to communicate with the other world. It's just a matter of learning the ways in which that can happen. So what I started to notice is that when I would speak to women from East Africa, because every time I would go home, I grew up in Kenya, I have a lot of Somali family there, and after the war, we have a lot of Sudanese artists who have settled there. And so many of the women that I would come across, no matter what their background is, you know, even if they were not artists, even if they didn't come from families where this was common, they were receiving intense visions. And I would meet them, we start having conversations, and I think that we think of these visions and ancestor communication as something special. That's what we've been taught. What I'm realizing is in our indigenous cultures, this was something that everybody received.
Right.
And also the way that I grew up, I always would notice that if someone was a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, whatever it was, they still had an artistic practice. There still was that love of creation. So I think we're as humans wired towards that kind of communication, but it's been kind of educated out of us. And I just started to notice that it can't be a coincidence when, especially a lot of the Black women that I was speaking to from different countries from all around the world, continuously are receiving these messages that come through, and in ways that these are people who are completely grounded and healthy. It's not a schizophrenic break. And so that's when I started to realize that there is something beyond what we've been taught can be possible.
Where does your artistic practice stand in this moment? Do you feel that you actually ended up becoming an artist to dig deeper into those visions, into this connection with the unseen, with your connection with your ancestor? Is that like a way of like responding to this to this move that you decided to become an artist?
I don't think that I had that awareness when I became an artist.
Right.
I think that I started my spiritual practice and my spiritual path before I became an artist. But I think something happens quite commonly is that when we first start a spiritual practice or a spiritual journey, and what I'm talking about much more has to do with like an animist mystical practice. You know, I can't really speak to what the experience is of like following a more traditional Abrahamic kind of religious path. But when you're opening up yourself to like mysticism and animism, and as I said, the way that we practice our Islam is very animist and is very mystical. So it's very hard to pull those two, pull those two away. I think that you, in the first place, might be attracted to the things that we all know about, like the meditation, the awareness, the presence, the prayer, all of these things that are stillness practices. But then something happens along the way where you start to open yourself up to, and you realize it's almost an initiation where like a veil is dropped. And all of a sudden you realize you're like, wow, there's so much more than just me. And this is the thing about Western spirituality. It's all about the me. It's about the self. But when you open up yourself to the animism, it's about what do I have in my path to steward? What is it that I'm meant to basically make space to help in?
Right.
So the way that I see it is that we come into this world and that we are in this physical world as basically conduits between the unseen and the seen. And that our practice, and I'll say for me personally, is to basically help bring messages that help the community that you're a part of. And that doesn't have to be a global community. For me, it's very much my family and my friends and the people, my loved ones. And part of it is because the ancestors are on the other side, basically wanting to assist you in helping heal some of the traumas that you have in a family. So what I've noticed in my practice is that, yes, I'm making ceramics as a practice to research my own ancestry and also to bring forth stories that have been kind of put under the rug and not been allowed to have space, and also change the narrative in which people are consuming a lot of this knowledge from that part of the world. But it's also to talk about the disconnection that we have in family systems from oppressed people and oppressed lineages. And I think this is something that people don't talk about enough, is that there has been such a great trauma and a lot of our elders didn't have the capacity to hold that. There's this intergenerational knowledge that has been broken, and a lot of families are experiencing the effect of that break. And within the family system, there is this lack of capacity to actually process what's happening. So what I've noticed when I've talked to friends who are artists from the global south and from histories that have been affected by colonization is that their art is also about healing. And I think that that's something that we don't talk about enough. One of the reasons why I've held back before from talking about this is because I had to process my own fear. Because I think, you know, coming from traditions where there's so much shame around these topics, I had to basically overcome the fear of like the backlash, you know, and also seeing other women from my region who have been so incredibly strong and brave and just being able to talk very honestly and being like, listen, we've had multiple different types of colonization and like, let's talk about the fact that like the loss of our own religious practices is also a trauma, but then we want to continue it, whether it's, you know, Christianity or Islam in Africa. That we, you know, in Islam, they talk so much about like the age of the Jahila, which is the age of ignorance, saying that anything before Islam was ignorance. And I'm like, there is a way to practice the mystical heart of Islam with the animist ways that we practiced and understand that, you know, I had this conversation with my father and we were talking about the fact that a land like Sudan, for instance, where he's from, is a place that has had and held so many different types of people, so many different types of culture. And we continue to evolve, we continue to change. And that's part of the superpower, is not to be stuck in one idea, but that shame, you know, this like fear of getting in trouble, I think holds a lot of people back. And part of my body of work that I'm exploring this year is talking about being an artist, being a woman, coming from a Muslim background, and having shame be something that holds you back. You know, that's a huge thing.
It's so interesting because so many of like how animist practices, because you were talking about animism, right? Like the belief that spiritual forces and ancestors exist also in non-animated objects, also in nature. All of those practices are very much like embedded within like Islam or Christianity. But also in some ways they are being practiced so secretly. And yet they still continued, right? So there's like a big duality here. And like, what has been your process and those arts and creating those like incredible like portal and vessel has been helping you going through this duality?
No, absolutely. I think, you know, the liberation that comes from being an artist for me has also been just having the freedom to not be at a 9 to 5, for instance. Like that was a big thing. Like I had a, you know, background in development and I worked at a big foundation in New York for 7 years before I ever became an artist. I never went to art school. Like art was something that I discovered in my late 20s. Like, of course, I was always artistic since I was a child. But because of the conditioning of the family structure that I lived in, I never thought that it would be possible for me to ever be an artist. It was never a vocation or even a career that was in my environment. And, you know, I remember being at this job and just telling myself what I want of my life is I want to never have to work with people who I don't get along with and who I don't like. And that was something, and like, bless the people that I worked with. They were wonderful, but they were not my people. And I was like, I either leave now or the money's going to be too good for, and I'm not going to be able to ever escape. And I think part of that spiritual practice too is to be able to listen in that moment. Something told me, like all my friends, you know, my friend, I caught up with a friend and she told me, she was like, you know, what you did was absolutely insane. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, do you remember you took 3 months of a ceramic course and decided you were quitting your job and this was going to be your life? And I told her, I'm like, something guided me within me.
Did you felt it?
And I felt it. And that's the thing also about mystical teachings is people are like, tell me how I get there. It's not about following my formula. The mystical teaching is about following your internal guidance because something that works for someone else doesn't work for you. So this whole thing of trying to listen to people who've made it or whatever it is as a way to replicate their path. The mystical path is when you're at that fork in the road, do you know what you're being told to do? And then you always have to take the risk when you're being told to go a certain way. And that's the big practice and that's the challenge.
Yeah, it is. Is there like an ancestors that you listen to, that you are close to, that's like particularly present?
Absolutely. It's very interesting. I feel like, there are ancestors who I knew and some who I didn't. So I'll take my grandmothers as an example. I never met my mother's mother. She died when my mom was very young. And then my father's mother I grew up with. And she was such a, like, she carried so much of that Nubian, Sufi, matriarchal energy. So I feel like a lot of who I am is shaped by watching how she moved. And she had incredible integrity and, had 13 children. And so we have like 43 cousins, and she was just so amazing. But I feel her guidance very much. But then what's also very interesting is that my mother's mother started to come to me in dreams. And my mother comes from a lineage of dreamers. And although I don't think she necessarily fully awoke to that in her lifetime, when we were growing up, she always had incredible premonitions. Like, she would see people right before they passed. If my mother told us not to do something as children, we knew that there was power in that.
Right.
But I told my parents, I remember a few years ago, I was like, mom's mom, like, started coming to me.
So you were able to have those conversations with your family.
Yeah. And I think because there is that understanding of communication, from the other world that's there, they were able to take it in. And I was telling them, like, I saw her in a dream, but then also I would feel her. And sometimes I would feel her in really random things. I started to want to learn how to cook Somali food, and I'd be in the kitchen, and then all of a sudden I would like feel her, like almost like in my body, guiding me as to what to do. Also, like, when I'd be having like hard times in my life, I would see her and like feel her. I'd be like in bed, and she would come, and I could feel her just like, yeah, just put your head on my lap. Let me just take care of you, or tell me like, you need to stop doing this. Like, this is the last day that you're engaging in this like destructive behavior. Yeah. If you want to continue in this path and you want the blessing, like, you have to get rid of this. Yeah. And then what you have to do is like, all right, this thing's out, And it's that fortitude to when a challenge is put in front of you, that you jump and you trust.
Yeah. You talk about the more than human world. Is there where you believe your ancestors are, and you have learned to like constantly like communicate with them and having them guiding you like your grandmother?
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm still so young in many ways, I'm close to 40, but still so young in terms of there's so much that I don't understand. And I'm lucky to have a few elders and a few aunts that I'm able to lean on. But I'm still trying to understand what the classification of what these dimensions look like and what they are. I think a lot of people are on that path of trying to figure that out. So I know that there's, for me, and when I say I know, it's like within my own knowing, I know that there is a world in which those who have been embodied exist. And then there's a world in which those who are never human and who are other exist. The sheikh is basically someone who's like a scholar of Islam. And usually the sheikhs in Sudan and in Somalia are a lot of the time seers. And they're people who, there's such a spectrum. Like, you'll have people that you go to who are very by the book and very orthodox. And then you have people that you go to who literally are intermediaries between worlds, and they will come to your property, and then they'll be able to see the jinns that are there, and they'll tell you these are the prayers we need to do, and these are the offerings we need to make. And so I really do believe that there is this world of the unseen. And then, when you go into like mythology of ancient Egypt and Nubia that we were talking about earlier, is that some people even believe that these gods were just different beings that existed in another world.
Right.
And the gift of the ancient Egyptian and Nubian civilization, like a lot of great civilizations, those in South America, those in Asia, all over the world, is that they were able to basically see a certain dimension in which these beings existed, and they were able to basically replicate it through the art, through the architecture, through the adornment, through the objects. They were basically bringing that which existed in a divine realm into this one, and which I really believe is why so many people connect to ancient Egypt, is because it's speaking to something that exists in another dimension.
And this is how you're seeing your artistic practice also?
In what way?
The sculpture that you are making, is it for you something that's also coming from the unseen world?
I think like all creative acts, because we're taking something that's disembodied and making it, come into this world, even if it's music. Music is
Materials.
still something
Right.
that's coming into this world that we're able to experience. So I think all creative acts is taking and that's the channel. It's like we're radio signals and we're finding a certain dimension, and we're bringing something down from that. Even like aesthetic expressions. When someone has an aesthetic expression that's just so dialed, I'm like, oh, you tapped into another world and you're able to be a conduit for that world. And I remember one of the messages that I received, probably in a meditation or something, it told me, if you create something that comes from that unseen world, it'll always be received because it exists within every person. And so that's the thing, is when you get out, it's the universality of it. That's why certain art, when you walk through a gallery or an exhibition, it really hits you because you see that person transmitted something beyond.
And it's way beyond like any cultures, any time, any religion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you see yourself in this world? How would you like describe you being?
In this
Who
world.
are you?
Yeah.
And who are we?
I think for myself, I really feel like I belong to kind of multiple communities of people. And that's like how I see myself. Even in the work that I do, it only is possible because of the people that I'm able to be around. Even when I think of like my artistic practice or anything that I've been able to do, it's because I'm in this network with a lot of people and a lot of artists who kind of think in this particular way. So I sometimes try to get out of the like, who am I thing, because it's so defined by who I collectively am with other people. And I think it also like helps stay out of this like special thinking, which I think can be very destructive to an artist, to think that like your transmission is the only transmission that has value.
Very special and very different from everyone.
Yes. And I think that specialness is remedied with collective communal experiences and understanding, and that this shadow work or these difficult things that we have to kind of work through as humans, as artists, is that it requires community. Like visionary experiences don't happen individually. I want to become someone who, in a community that can hold the next generation of people, but also because my friend talked about us being like spiritual orphans, because we are the people trying to like define what it is that we are, that I almost see it as like parts of the puzzle are coming through multiple people in a collective, and that it's not one person that is going to receive the full message. And this is part, I think, of like kind of decolonizing the idea of like, even like these ideas that we're given of like this one man that's coming to solve the whole thing. It's like, no, it comes through multiple people in collective experiences, building new rituals together. And I think that's the other part of it, is like I center so much of my practice around ritual, because I really believe that the disconnection of our ancient rituals is why a lot of us are so sick right now. Those rituals are the remedy to a lot of that pain.
Is there like a ritual in particular that you feel is really incredible and should be back into all our lives?
I think it's hard for me to say a particular ritual, but I think that rituals what I will say is grief is a really important one. I was listening to someone who was talking about that trauma does not happen because of the event. Trauma happens because of the lack of alchemizing that event and actually being able to process it. So I think grief, and I've seen people in my own family really be shattered by grief. And I think that that's one of those emotions that you can't process on your own. And I think it's incredibly important to have rituals around this. And a lot of the time we have to build new rituals, because the reality is we're in a diverse, culturally mixed environment. We don't have one cultural lineage that we can lean on. So for instance, I had a dear friend whose father passed, and we came together in a ritual. We like represented every continent there, and what was so beautiful is that we were able to build new rituals of acknowledging our own loved ones who passed, putting in seeding prayers for the things and the people that we want to improve relationships with. And then also just holding someone in that pain that they're moving through. And so I really believe in, yes, we have to be rooted in what was, but we also have to look forward towards the future. Something my father would always teach me is that, culture is by definition moving all the time. What we think is traditional might have only come into our families or our culture 100 years ago.
Right.
And, it's this idea of like, a friend also would say this is tend to the fire, but don't worship the ashes. So have that respect for what was. But when it's dying, don't hold on to what is dying.
Create your own.
And be in that place of being able to evolve. But also that comes with collective regulation. You have to make sure that you're moving along with all of the variables in your ecosystem being tended for.
Right.
It's not
a collective.
It's a collective. It's not I'm deciding we're moving on in this way and it's a hierarchy. No, it's this aspect of listening to like what it is that needs to happen and unfold.
Yeah. What is creation to you?
Yeah, what is creation to me? For me, creation is having a feeling and wanting to alchemize it into something. And I think a lot of people will say, well, I'm not an artist. And it's like, well, did you curate a beautiful table for a loved one during a gathering? Like that's an act of creation, Even in the way people adorn themselves, you came into a beautiful space and you dressed in a way that feels authentic to you. This is the big thing, is it's not about fashion. It's about what allows you to embody the archetype in which you want to carry that evening. And that for me is an act of creation. And so life every day is being in creation. And that's why I'm like, my art is the everyday. Even sometimes I can't be in the studio for a whole month because I need a break. And you know what? I am in creation all the time. And for me, the way that I see it is there's a feeling. I remember when I never was a dancer, but when I was in college, I would take classes at an African dance studio. And I remember it was an experience those years that taught me how to take a feeling and then translate that into something. And so I feel like that was a foundation that helped me in my practice. It's like, oh, now I know what it feels like to have something and then to want to make it embodied. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dina. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing all those very personal and deep view of the world and of your spiritual practice. Thank you.
Yeah.